So, why did an extremely expensive independent film, based on a comic book not very well known outside of France, not do very well at the box office? Well, I guess that's the answer. See you next time. Valerian, or to give it its full title, Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets, is a sci-fi from Luc Besson, who also directed the wildly successful The Fifth Element, which incidentally Valerian illustrator Jean-Claude worked on. The Fifth Element was inspired in part from Mézière's Valerian and Laureline, a French sci-fi comic Mézière created in 1967 with Pierre Christin. Valerian was made for an estimated $180 to $200 million, with prints and advertising costs probably doubling those figures for total expenditure. It's reportedly the most expensive independent film ever made, and the most expensive non-US film, and having so far recouped between $65 and $70 million at the time of recording, it doesn't look like it will hit the minimum $350 million it needs to make a profit. But despite it being incredibly expensive, it was financed like an indie, so I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. Personally, I'd have been very surprised if Valerian had turned out to be the start of a fresh new franchise, as some were hoping. But credit where credit's due, it's nice to see a big title that isn't a remake, or a reboot, or a sequel. Really, Valerian had lots of things preventing it from becoming a hugely profitable film. But, much like my thoughts on The Mummy, I think Valerian's main obstacle to it turning a profit was that it cost way too much. The Mummy, of course, was a rather off-note beginning to Marvel's Dark Universe. Valerian was, in my opinion, too ambitious for a first film in a hypothetical franchise that had nowhere near the recognition of The Mummy's story or Tom Cruise. I think it would have been far more prudent to make Valerian on a much smaller budget, and then there would have been a greater chance of profit, which would have allowed a great big budget, as Valerian has now, to be spent on a sequel. As well as costing more than a film based on what I consider fairly unproven source material should, I also think that the budget should have warranted far more recognisable lead actors. Whilst Valerian and Laureline, the comic, does have an international audience, most of the audience is based in France. So, a good way to reach out to people unfamiliar with the source material is with a bankable star. Cara Delevingne and Dane DeHaan, whilst not inexperienced, speaking strictly from a business point of view, have very limited star power. It doesn't matter if they're good actors or not. I don't think many people will go to see Valerian for them. But I do think that The Mummy would have done far worse if Tom Cruise's character had been taken by Jim Beaver. Very good actor, Jim Beaver. Not quite the same pull power as Tom Cruise, though. Rhianna Fenty, Clive Owen, Ethan Hawke and Rutger Hauer are a very strong additional cast, but if only the leads had been as recognisable as them. I'm not trying to be nasty to Delevingne or DeHaan, I just think one of their characters should have been played by an A-list actor, or someone who's very recognisable and whose star is already on the rise. So, as well as the source material and the lead actors not really being well enough known, I think I should also say that I've heard it suggested that Luc Besson's name wasn't big enough. But I don't know. Besson is very well known, and I think he's very well respected, but also I don't think it's that relevant. The remake of The Thing didn't flop because it was an unknown director at the helm. Maybe if it was Spielberg, more people would have come to see it. But I think the audience pull from Luc Besson wasn't the critical factor in the film flopping. Frankly, the film is too large for the small demographic of people who go to see blockbusters based on who the director is to really matter. I think most people go to see blockbuster films, not because of the director, but because of the star, the franchise, or dare I say it, the content. Besson's recent film, Lucy, earned $460 million globally on only a $40 million budget. But I wouldn't attribute that incredible return to Lucy being a Luc Besson film, just as I wouldn't attribute Valerian flopping to it being a Luc Besson film. I'd argue that much more importantly than Besson's name, financially, was his direction. How he shaped the story, as well as the story he was shaping and telling. I'm not sure if Valerian captured a great deal of imaginations of people not already familiar with the comic. I'm not convinced this was nothing more than a passion project, but at the same time, who wanted this? The Fifth Element is much loved, but I don't think I'm doing that film a disservice by saying something that was made 20 years ago is old news. The Fifth Element isn't Star Wars, and Valerian isn't the Fifth Element. I'm sure this film will gather a cult following the same way the Fifth Element did, but I'm not sure Valerian will ever be quite as celebrated. Sci-fi can be a hit and miss genre, and I feel sci-fi has to go one of two ways when you're thinking about a mass audience. A wacky or comedic sci-fi, which can attract casual moviegoers who are attracted by a film being fun, and might see the sci-fi elements as a bit geeky or really just incidental. Or opposite to that, an atmospheric and thoughtful sci-fi that appeals to fans of the genre, like Blade Runner or THX. I'm not sure Valerian managed to communicate where on the sci-fi spectrum it lay, and personally I don't think its advertising was particularly effective. The trailers and previews seemed to rely a lot on the stunning visual effects, but I think that is far less effective now than it was 10 years ago. I think that's pretty much what audiences expect from a big title. But spectacle isn't enough to draw audiences into theatres. It's my opinion that the way Valerian was presented to us didn't leave most potential moviegoers with the same excitement that Besson himself has for the source material, or with the impression that this film is particularly unique, which I think would have served it very well had its out-of-the-ordinary facets really been played up. It can't have helped things that initial reactions from audiences and critics were pretty much meh. A better meh than for The Mummy, but a meh all the same. Meh. Whilst Valerian wasn't panned in the same way that The Mummy was, I haven't seen any reviews or online reactions that say, "This is a great film, you have to go and see it." I've not seen anything like that. Valerian has done a decent trade in France, as you would hope and expect, and it will open in China on the 25th of August. It's still yet to make much of its money, but it does seem that it's not going to make all of its money back. I've heard some of the blame placed on its opening at the same time as Dunkirk, and a week after War for the Planet of the Apes. But still, the box office results were lackluster after its opening weekend. Besson's independent studio, EuropaCorp, brought on a number of equity partners, and the film was paid for by a number of different backers who contributed wildly different sums. EuropaCorp sold distribution rights to the film before principal photography even began, and EuropaCorp has said that the financial exposure to the studio itself is under $20 million. So maybe Valerian doesn't represent a huge risk to Besson's studio, at least not financially. When I was researching this video, I found a number of articles written before Valerian had come out, speculating that it would be a flop. I think in terms of business, it just wasn't the right film to make for $200 million. Well, those are my thoughts on why Valerian bombed. I'd love to know what you guys think, and whether or not you enjoyed the movie. Thanks very much for joining me, be sure to leave a like, and join me next time where I'll be discussing how the Rocky film series changed over time. See you then. This video is Jim Beaver approved.